Good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 24th meeting of 2019. Agenda item 1 is business in private, and a decision is required on taking, if the committee agrees to taking the review of the evidence heard on item 3 on Brexit contingency planning in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. And do members also agree to consider item 6, which is consideration of our forward work programme in private? Agreed? Agreed. Thank you for that. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on the Scottish Biometrics Commission Bill. I refer members to paper 1, which is a paper by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome our panel of witnesses for this morning: Dr. Ken MacDonald, Head of ICO Regions for Information Commissioner's Office; Al Duff, Professor of Information Policy at Edinburgh Napier University and a member of the NO2ID Edinburgh; and Matthew Rice, Scottish Director of Open Rights Group; and last but not least, Julia Robertson, Chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Can I thank members for taking the trouble to put in written submissions? I can't tell you how invaluable that is to the committee, that we have opportunity to see these submissions in writing before we take formal evidence. And with that, I now move to the first question and ask the panel if they're in broad agreement that the proposal to introduce the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner is a timely one, and that do you think the government has got this right? Who'd like to start with that? It's a fairly easy one to start with.
I'm happy to start. The Scottish Human Rights Commission, of which I'm the chair, generally supports the direction of travel of this bill. We've been working alongside John Scott and the Independent Advisory Group looking at this issue for a number. We've been involved in it for a couple of years, but we know that there's been a huge amount of work has been done prior to that process, important work which has recognised both the need for clarity around the regulation in relation to biometrics in Scotland, and the recognition that human rights are engaged. Article 8, the right to private family life, is engaged in this process. That recognition is clear and explicit within the legislation that's being proposed here, and we welcome that process. We have some concerns, or would like to see that legislation strengthened in various ways, which obviously this evidence session will explore in more detail. Yeah. But we think that this is a start, actually, in terms of that process.
That's helpful. It's really just on the timing just now. If you know this is right, could it be later? Could it be whatever? And Matthew.
Yeah. So Open Rights Group have been involved in the kind of policy debates around the creation of a Biometrics Commissioner in Scotland since 2017, and throughout we've been consistent in supporting the creation of such a Commissioner. So to answer the question specifically, we are in broad agreement in the direction of travel and think it is a timely addition to the landscape in Scotland, but there are some specific areas that we think can be improved upon.
Aldous?
I'm representing No2ID, which is an organisation opposed to identity cards in any form and to the growth of the database state. We think it's a step in the right direction, but we are looking for something rather different from what I think this bill has in mind. We're looking for a fully fledged information protector for Scotland, and we think that
specifically just now, content?
The timing is absolutely right.
Okay. And Dr. MacDonald?
Thank you. Yes, as you're aware, I served on the Independent Advisory Group, which the reports led to the bill, and obviously I'm content that the bill is going through. I represent the UK Information Commissioner. I see this as complementary to our work. I think there have been some concerns raised that there might be overlap, but we've got the experience of working with the UK Biometrics Commissioner, who you heard last week, and anything, I think, which helps clarify the way in which biometric information, which can be quite intrusive information, is held and used in Scotland has to be welcomed.
Okay, thank you for that. So drilling down a little bit further now, the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner's general function is to support, promote lawful, effective and ethical practices in relation to acquisition, retention, use and destruction of biometric data by Police Scotland and by the Scottish Police Authority. It's good just to get that on record at the beginning. Are the witnesses satisfied that this general function is sufficiently fit for purpose? And if not, what changes should be made to ensure that it is? And perhaps, Al Duff, you'd like to come in now.
Would like to, thank you. We think we need a lot more than someone who's covering just police use of facial recognition and biometric data. We want to see a fully fledged, not part-time, information champion, or rather privacy champion for Scotland, to supplement the role of the Scottish Information Commissioner, whose remit should be freedom of information. The information polity requires, in addition, someone to champion the other side of the coin, which is privacy and data protection. So we have in mind a fully fledged privacy commissioner who will look not just at facial recognition data, but at any kind of cameras, any kind of data, and whether coming from the police, the secret services, the public sector, or the private sector, and will be an ombudsman, a port of resort for inquiries, someone to engage in and commission research on privacy, and someone to be a champion for privacy in the Scottish public sphere. So it goes well beyond facial recognition. We think this bill is far too narrow, and it's a part-time position which never really works. We're looking for someone who can actually take the bull by the horns and cover privacy in every respect. For example, cameras in school toilets, cameras in school classrooms. They're not facial recognition level, they are CCTV. We think that's a problem. The police filming of innocent football crowds on a routine basis, this isn't facial recognition necessarily, but we think it's wrong. So we think we need something much bigger than what you have in mind, and we think it will show that the Scottish Government and Parliament is ahead of the curve as we enter into the global information society.
That's clearly going to be a huge piece of work. I mean, would it be your position that rather than have nothing at this time, this would be a step perhaps in the right direction?
I don't see why you can't redraft the bill. It's not a lot of extra work. It doesn't have to be tied to any particular law. The person we have in mind would be dealing with not just data protection law, but other laws relating to privacy, so they'd have a freewheeling role and not be tied to any particular act. I don't see why you can't go back to the drawing board a little. You've done a lot of good work. Facial recognition is the top issue at the moment, but you're in grave danger of producing an anomaly and something that doesn't meet all of the issues. So there's an opportunity now for the Scottish Parliament to do something new. It will be reported all around the world if you fund a privacy commissioner. I only know one other country in the world that has both an information commissioner and a privacy commissioner, and that is Canada. It has led the way, and in many respects we should be emulating Canada on this issue.
Okay, and Ken MacDonald, and then I'll bring in supplementaries once I've heard from all the panel.
Sorry, Convener, I have to just clarify the legal situation here. As I say, I represent the UK Information Commissioner's Office. It's headquartered in Wilmslow, just south of Manchester, but we have a small office here in Melville Street, and we've also got ones in Belfast and Cardiff, which I head up. Data protection is a reserved matter. And, you know, whilst I can understand the concerns of Professor Duff, it's not within the legislative competence of this Parliament at present to legislate in terms of the data protection side of things. So there is no opportunity for you to have a privacy commissioner of the sort he's suggesting.
Thank you, that's helpful. I'll bring on the members and you can come back once they've had a shot and we've had some supplementaries because there may be some questions to you. Yes, Judith.
To your specific question about the role of the Commissioner in general, we have some concerns about that, in that the draft bill does not principally define the Commissioner as a body with powers to scrutinise the police in relation to their use of biometrics, but rather with a general function to promote the adoption of lawful and ethical practices. It's problematic from our perspective because it detracts from the primary role of what we consider should be the primary role of promoting and investigating compliance against a code of practice in relation to the collection, use and retention and disposal of biometric data. We think that making that very explicit in the legislation affords the strongest protection in relation to the intrusion in people's rights, and makes sure that that is the purpose of the Commissioner.
In fact, it hasn't got enforcement, it lacks teeth, in other words.
It does at the moment, in its current form, yes.
Thank you. And Matthew Rice?
Yeah, so briefly, we have some concerns about the scope of the Commissioner's role. While we would not go as far as Professor Duff, we do think that focusing on biometrics is clearly an issue of high public concern, but that doesn't end with law enforcement. There's quite clearly applications of biometrics in private sector and other public sector bodies that carries the public's concern. And so we feel that the bill is slightly narrowed unhelpfully in that. And I also agree with Judith's piece and the Scottish Human Rights Commission about putting the Commissioner on a stronger footing in terms of investigating and maintaining compliance with the statutory code.
Thank you. Liam, can you do supplementary?
Thank you, Convener. Very briefly, Professor Duff, you talked earlier on, when you were speaking about this being a part-time role, I think it was 0.6 FTE. This committee raised that concern in previous sessions, but was given assurances that it was the strength of the team backing up that would ensure that the part-time status wouldn't be a problem. Do you disagree with that?
Yes, strongly, because we envisage a wider role and a much greater role for this individual. It would have to be a full-time position. Otherwise, to me, that would suggest that the Scottish Government and Parliament are not taking privacy seriously.
Sorry, right, thank you. Well, as you come on, there'll be other opportunities for you to speak more fully on anything you think hasn't been covered. But to move on, can I ask Lee MacArthur to...
Thanks very much. Good morning, panel. This was an issue we covered with the panel last week. I think we were given assurances by the Commissioner for England and Wales that the extent of the role was broad-ranging enough, and indeed the powers were extensive enough. But we've clearly had concerns from yourself and from others that have given written evidence that even within the criminal justice system, if you were to look at, for example, the prison service is not covered by the provisions of this bill. Are there ways in which almost even incrementally you would see an extension of those powers through this bill being achieved from the perspective of a part-time commissioner in the initial stages? I'm just trying to see if we can establish where the areas of priority are and how we might move forward to something that is more all-encompassing in due course.
Can I answer that directly? I think one of the ways the bill could be strengthened, which would enable that process incrementally to develop over time, is by establishing the code of practice which was developed by the Independent Advisory Group on a statutory basis. Actually put the code of practice into the legislation and give it, make it an explicit statement in the legislation. The code of practice in and of itself is something which could be reviewed. The legislation currently looks at that, but gives the authority to the Commissioner to develop that. We think that absolutely this bill should put that on the face of the bill, because then the Commissioner there is absolute clarity, and there is clarity for the Commissioner, there's clarity for the police and the authorities that are bound by this legislation currently. But what it also does is provide a model of very good practice. It makes it very clear what the general principles, the parameters are in relation to how biometrics should be dealt with generally, and that provides an opportunity for that then to be applied in a more general basis to the other spheres and areas of concern. We too recognise that this is a step in the right direction, but does not cover everything that would potentially need to be covered by biometrics legislation.
But would it need to explicitly refer to whether it's the prison service, whether it's private companies that are gathering biometrics on behalf of the police or SPA, would that need to be explicitly set out in the legislation, or would putting the code of practice on a statutory footing, as you suggest, allow the Commissioner oversight in those areas?
I think you would sorry, I'm not, in the basis of the actual legislation itself, I think you would probably need to extend which authorities the legislation was intended to cover. I suppose I would also argue that the code of practice, as was written by the Independent Advisory Group, was developed particularly with Police Scotland and the SPA in mind. It was heavily consulted on that basis. There was evidence taken from across the different sectors to really look at that and to support it. Possibly, if you were to extend the scope of this legislation, you would maybe have to extend the scope of that consultation to ensure that the code of practice in itself did the job that was required by those other authorities and was broad enough. It wasn't developed for that purpose for this, as far as I understand it.
I mean, I don't want to create any sort of false choices here, and it didn't necessarily need to be an either-or, but in terms of the order of priority, is the putting the code of practice on a statutory footing more imperative for you at this stage than expanding the reach over which these provisions apply?
Oh, I think you've just created a false choice. But what I would say is it's really important to put the code of practice on a statutory footing. Right. I would also argue that it is important to extend the scope. I don't think these are alternatives.
Absolutely.
So specifically on whether or not you can kind of obviously amend and add to this. So you've got Section 7, Part 4 of the effect of the code, which allows for Scottish ministers to add a person or description of a person that the code would have an effect upon. So currently it has an effect on constables and police staff of the Police Service Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. You could conceivably see an opportunity to add the prison service, but I would go back to the problem with adding, say, a private body is that the general functions of the Commissioner would still relate to criminal justice and policing purposes. So there may be other purposes by which biometrics would be used that wouldn't necessarily be covered or deemed legitimate to add to this. So you would need to return to the functions to have a look to see whether or not you can pull this out to say biometric data in the field of public bodies and on the use of it by private bodies towards the general public. And then at that point, you have Section 7, Part 4, which would allow ministers to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of where they want to place it. But in terms of the actual code of practice, it would still leave more of a kind of champion rather than a regulator, given the fact that it's a kind of promotion role.
And would you have any anxieties about spreading the reach as well as putting the code of practice on a statutory footing in terms of the establishment of the Commissioner and the fact that what you've done essentially is required more of it from the get-go, and therefore, in a sense, there are more things that could potentially go wrong or not work as effectively as they might? I
mean, one of the lessons that should be learned from the England and Wales Commissioner is that when you started off with a narrow problem, they found a very narrow solution, but that problem was never narrow to begin with. And so you have now a situation where you have a Commissioner in England and Wales who regulates the use of fingerprints, DNA and footprints, much to his own hilarity, it seems, but doesn't actually go into these second-generation biometrics, the real crux of public concern around gait recognition or facial recognition. And so I think in terms of the anxieties are more like we fix this narrow issue that is also kind of profound in terms of a law enforcement context, but that we don't actually future-proof for what the public needs. And so the bigger anxiety is that the public will see a Commissioner and expect something of them that they may not be able to deliver, and then that results in a loss of confidence in terms of the public's trust in what that Commissioner can be relied upon to do. So I think that's my greater source of anxiety.
Professor Duff or Dr. McDonald?
I would agree with that and reiterate my point that we need a rounded, holistic approach to privacy, because threats to privacy come from all directions. Facial recognition is just the latest iteration. There'll be things after it. We need someone who can grab the bull by its horns and run with it. And to take up Dr. McDonald's point, it is of course still the case that data protection is not devolved and is covered by the Information Commissioner's office in London. But should that be the case, and should the government not be pushing to have data protection devolved, I would suggest that the SNP should be forcing that issue and enabling a situation where all aspects of data, whether it's high resolution, facial recognition, or grainy CCTV, comes under the remit of a Scottish Privacy Commissioner who will be completely future-proofed.
Dr. MacDonald.
With regards to code of practice, we have a number of statutory codes which we find is a useful tool in our work. They give us flexibility as the landscape changes. We can amend them. We do, of course, need to get them approved by the Westminster Parliament. And I'd certainly urge that the codes of practice that the Biometric Commissioner has, if this goes through, are put in a statutory footing.
The point Matthew Rice made about unless you sort of start out wide, it's very difficult to start narrow and go wide, but if you start wide, there's certainly a better opportunity to broaden the scope of it in due course. Is that something you...
That's right. I mean, the codes give you the flexibility to adjust as change takes place, and as Matthew has also said, you know, we've got a lot more future-proofing in the terms of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, rather than Professor Wiles faces. We've seen it before in terms of the previous data protection regime, which hadn't allowed at all for the technological advances, electronic and biological, which have now really been taken in under the GDPR. And that's where there's an overlap between the work of this Commissioner and my Commissioner.
Thanks.
Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to probe a wee bit on the earlier part of Liam MacArthur's question regarding the list of those who should be consulted about the code of practice. Judith Robertson, you said you felt it could be widened a bit and it should maybe be a further consultation. What issues would that, what do you think it should cover, the consultation with stakeholders?
Well, I suppose ideally the code of practice has the draft code as was produced by the Independent Advisory Group has been widely consulted. As I understand it, it was consulted on the basis of it focusing on the criminal justice system. Is that correct? So if the scope of this legislation were to be broadened into health, education, other areas where biometrics might be in use and in play, I would contend that the scope of the consultation around that would have to be broadened to ensure that the actors in those sectors, the job of work that the code of practice as it's currently framed does is appropriate and fit for purpose for the broadened scope. So that's one aspect. The recommendation of the advisory group was that the code of practice went into this legislation and therefore would be consulted on as the legislation was going through Parliament in the way that any other legislative process goes through Parliament. And in addition to the consultation which took place prior to the code being drafted, then it would be subjected to the general and robust scrutiny that it is undertaken as legislation is passed. It's not here, and therefore that opportunity has been missed in terms of engaging a wider audience and the wider public in terms of a debate around that code. So in terms of the panel principles, which are the principles that the Commission and promote in terms of really underpinning human rights law, an opportunity has been lost here for that scrutiny to have been undertaken. But that doesn't say that the code couldn't be included in the second stage of the bill, which obviously has further scrutiny, and that would then strengthen the participation. So does that begin to answer your question?
Yes,
does it get to what we're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds from what you're saying that maybe that remit would require more than a part-time commissioner. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah,
I didn't answer that bit of that conversation, but yeah, I completely agree. So a number of things. It may be appropriate for a part-time commissioner to fulfil the function as it's described in the legislation. If a commissioner is going to meet the, well, there's two ways you can look at this. and ultimately will come down to resources. But if a part-time commissioner had a strong code in legislation which it was working to, that general understanding was established, they weren't having to do that promotion, which in and of itself is potentially expensive, but were actually working with something that was in basis, possibly the part-time nature of that role would be enough, because it was very clear what it was they were monitoring, and the scope of who they were monitoring, the actions of which public authorities, were very clear. As soon as you broaden that, you're actually massively extending the scope of the role. So therefore there would be resource implications following that up. I couldn't say anything else. I mean, yeah, that's slightly stretching my mandate as the Human Rights Commissioner, but I mean, based on my own experience in the role, we have a very, very broad mandate, and full-time is not enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on that aspect?
In terms of who we should be consulting with, I mean, if you expanded it to public authorities, then you would engage COSLA and that network, right? And so that would be recommended to bring that in. And in fact, while the Independent Advisory Group's report had a specific terms of reference to focus on law enforcement, they did acknowledge that there were questions, mostly by us, I guess, that had brought it up to say that maybe this should be considered for wider application. And I believe the Scottish Government did say that they were going to explore with COSLA and other local and public bodies about potentially voluntary adoption. And I don't know whether that recommendation has been followed up or how far those conversations have progressed, but that, of course, would be your immediate body that you would go to. And then I guess it's a tricky one in terms of the part-time role, because the Biometrics Commissioner in England and Wales is part-time, yet regulates how many police forces? 30 so, 40 so? Whereas what we have here is 0.6 at FTE regulating one central police authority. So you could have a question that you could perhaps add further bodies without stretching into a full-time application. And to bear in mind that there is obviously fantastic support staff behind each of these commissioners that do work full-time, like Lucy Bradshaw-Morrow at the Commissioner. So it's not as though putting it at part-time means that it's an unstaffed place on Thursdays and Fridays. There is a team. There may not just be that figurehead that's there, right? But yeah, so it's a tricky one about how the nature of policing in Scotland maybe changes the regulatory landscape a little bit.
And given its current remit, are there any glaring omissions in terms of stakeholders who should be consulted that you haven't seen? You know, obviously Police Scotland, Lord Advocate, Scottish Human Rights Commission. Anybody glaring under its current, remit that you think should be consulted?
There's nothing that jumps out. I mean, I felt Part J of Section 3 is most likely refers to broader civil society and areas like that, and we would hope that it doesn't need to be written on the face of the bill that you have to consult with wider members of the public or interested parties, and that's kind of implied, that it would be appropriate for the Commissioner to go towards groups like ourselves. And so, yeah, I don't have an immediate concern.
Immediate, that's fine. Thank you. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon.
I was just going to say, reflection, if you're really thinking about people's engagement with Article 8 rights, if you're actually thinking about the right to privacy, family, home, family life, the widest engagement is recommended, because the public really need to understand what's at stake here. And I think that is poorly understood at the moment. And whether it's in terms of their Article 8 rights, whether it's in terms of understanding what currently is the practice in relation to retention of data, for example, whether it's understanding of what consent might imply in these processes, there's a range of aspects which the draft code of practice, as it's drafted, unpicks. It's quite explicit about very many of those, and that making that much more explicit for me in the legislation means that the public can go straight to that. They can identify that. They know that it's got a basis in law, and it's supported in that way. So that obviously civil society organisations are very good. What's the word? Benchmarks routes into the public, but the Parliament having a robust debate around Article 8 and how the balance and the protection of those rights is a really important part of the process.
Okay. Thank you.
Just following on from that comment, Emma, I'll start with you, Judith, but the Commissioner is to be appointed by the Parliament, but the code is to be approved by Scottish ministers. Do you have a comment on that?
Actually, you're right in terms of your absolutely, that is what the legislation says. That potentially is a weakness in that the code would be better. It would give better protections if the code was approved by the Parliament, and the code was debated by the Parliament. It was understood by the Parliament. The implications of the code were interrogated through a parliamentary process. And again, I come back to it. If it were placed on a statutory footing, that would mean that would be an integral part of the parliamentary process as it went through.
Okay. Other views from the rest of the panel, Matthew?
I concur with Judith's assessment there.
Al?
No comment.
I'd certainly agree again that it should be the Parliament rather than the Scottish ministers. And on the consultation on the code, I think it's a fairly comprehensive list for the consultation as the bill currently stands, and there is some flexibility. The Commissioner can choose other persons as considered appropriate. Certainly it needs to go at some stage to full public consultation, as Judith said. I think there is a need, though, in the initial drafting of the code to ensure that the Commissioner is properly consulting those bodies that have a direct interest in it.
Okay, thank you. Lee MacArthur, you wanted to follow up with this?
No.
Number 7?
I've already
You've done
moved
that?
it into
Okay,
the earlier
sorry
questions.
yeah. Okay, Fulton.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. Just wanted to ask your views on, it was slightly touched on, but only a wee bit, what your views on and how the code could address legal issues about where biometric data is held in databases outside of Scotland. It came up a wee, this question's come up a wee bit in the last evidence session just last week.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to follow that up.
Would you be able to expand a little bit more on what you mean by the kind of database information that's held outside?
So if biometric data is held within Scotland, it will obviously be the Commissioner, but if it's held elsewhere, perhaps maybe England or you know, another part of the UK, right, or somewhere else in Europe. Yeah. So and this is where stepping into an already kind of developed legislative environment needs to be kind of handled discreetly. So of course, while the Commissioner in England and Wales does not have a role to play when it comes to policing in Scotland, it does have a role to play when it comes to national security in Scotland, and then information that would be held by, such as the National Crime Agency, or I think specifically the National Crime Agency. So it's a tricky one in terms of how best to manage that. I don't have an immediate answer. And then there's a supplementary piece which is around data that would be held in Europe that would be transferred, say, for instance, across to British Transport Police, such as perhaps the Passenger Name Directive, or anything that might imply kind of people travelling and crossing borders that would have biometrics attached to it that might be used for law enforcement purposes. I would recommend I would hope that the Commissioner will be welcomed into that, the Scottish Commissioner will be welcomed into the landscape. There's plenty of advisory groups that sit across, and strategic advisory groups that Professor Wiles is part of, and of course the Information Commissioner Office would be part of as well. I can't say definitively where that would be best placed in terms of the bill, other than, like I said, hopefully just that the Commissioner would have, our Commissioner, Scottish Commissioner, would have a landscape, would be welcomed into that wider piece. Has anybody else got a view on that?
I think the discussion last week, if I recall correctly, was regarding where Scottish Police was putting data to the National Crime Database and the retention periods thereof. In strictly legal terms, it will come down to who's the data controller, and I would expect in most cases it would have been the Scottish organisation where it's considering Scottish biometric data, and therefore the Scottish rules of retention ought to apply, even if it's being held for their use by an authority outside of outside Scotland.
Okay, that's helpful. Somebody else?
That's a very good point, though, from Dr. MacDonald. There are some changes that are being undertaken in England and Wales around the retention of data, particularly police systems. So the Police National Computer and the Police National Database are both being currently reviewed and changed. Open Rights Group are contributing to that process as well as part of our UK work. And it's really key that Scotland has a really important voice to play in that. At the moment, it sits within the Home Office, and the contributions are as much as I can give in terms of a UK focus. But it's in fact something I think that Her Majesty's Inspectorate of the Constabulary in Scotland needs to be getting more involved in terms of being able to focus Scotland's good reputation in terms of how biometrics are being retained versus down in England and Wales. So as I understand it, the changes that will be taking place will be in a positive direction. And so I've got less concerns about how that transfers, because I think ultimately governance would retain with Police Scotland in terms of being a data controller, and control in terms of being able to delete that data, which is obviously one of the aspects of the Independent Advisory Group's idea of presumptions in favour of deletion. The really key point there is that when it does go into a UK system, that the bodies, and particularly Scottish policing bodies, are able to delete that, and that it is deleted rather than replicated onto a wider UK system that has a different retention period.
Okay, thank you.
John.
Morning panel. This is legislation we're looking at, and words are very, very important. Now, already there's been reference to the Code of Practice, and in the bill as introduced, Police Scotland and the SPA, quote, must have regard to the Code of Practice, and failure to do so doesn't itself render them liable to any legal action. Would you comment on that aspect, please, Pam?
Yes, I'll comment on that. We don't consider that to be strong enough. And actually, the greatest protection would be if they had a duty to comply to the Code of Practice. If the Code was on the statutory footing and on the face of the legislation, it would be very clear what it was they had a duty to comply to, and that if there was some deviation from the Code as deemed by the Commissioner, then there would be some kind of sanction. So the discussion on the sanctions, I think, is a really important part of the process. I don't know if we're going to come on to that, but again, from the perspective of giving the highest possible protection to citizens and, in fact, to the bodies which are implementing this code, having a degree of sanction which ensures people are held to account appropriately if the code is not applied, or if the Commissioner deems there are problems with the way it is being instituted, I think actually gives the Commissioner some teeth in the process. There are very many other examples of regulators having those kind of sanctions. The Information Commissioner is a very good example, a very strong example, has the capacity to fine. But so there's a range of potential sanctions that could be added that would strengthen the Commissioner's capacity. So at the moment, I would regard that as not strong enough. We could be a lot stronger.
Okay, thank you.
And as I understand it, the reason why it would be have regard to is because it wouldn't be passed onto a statutory footing, right? It would be considered to be secondary legislation or guidance, because, as Judith points out, we're not talking about the Code of Practice being on the face of the bill. And so we go back to that first point, which is, if we can't get it onto a statutory footing, then it's likely to remain have regard to, rather than in a much stronger duty to comply. So yeah, it's really back to that first question of where can we see the Code of Practice on this bill in some form.
If you accepted my premise that we need a Scottish Privacy Commissioner, a fully fledged role, I think the committee might be missing a golden opportunity if you don't revisit this bill to enable something much greater than what it has in mind. That would be this individual, this champion of privacy in Scotland, would have to have regard to many laws relating to privacy and data protection. And in some cases, it would have to be a legal obligation. In other cases, there wouldn't have to be a strict obligation, because this Privacy Commissioner would be able to shame malefactors, those who abuse data or privacy. There wouldn't have to be necessarily legislative machinery, because this person would be out there in the public domain championing privacy. And so he wouldn't just, or she wouldn't just be a functionary of one law and wouldn't just be looking at technicalities, but would be looking at the bigger picture. So I'm sort of shifting the paradigm completely.
Dr. MacDonald.
The codes of practice which the Information Commissioner produces are actually, you have to have regard to them rather than follow them. But I think there is a distinction between the issues which we face and the Biometrics Commissioner. We've got to give guidance, we've got to give good practice to every type of processing of personal data that goes on, private sector, public sector, biometric, electronic, etc., etc. And it's impossible to have a prescriptive code of practice under these situations. But here we're looking at a much more precise and narrow focus of processing of the responsibility that the Commissioner has. And I think, therefore, I would agree with Judith that it needs to be prescriptive and it needs to be beyond just having regard but statutory basis.
I wonder if the panel... Sorry.
Well, I was going to just add, like, one of the other tricky pieces to all of this is that the primary legislation in Scotland itself, even if we accepted that this secondary legislation would be strong and have, you know, good rhetorical flourish, the primary legislation, the backstop that we'd be looking, that this code of practice would be relying on, doesn't cover all biometrics. So the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act allows for samples to be taken that are fingerprints or other relevant physical samples that may be deemed necessary, but that does not cover photographic images. And so if we can't put the strong definition of what biometrics means in terms of the Commissioner's role onto a primary footing, then we're kind of creating this strange two-tier system where we have a very strong secondary legislative piece in terms of saying this is what biometrics means. It's the function of identifying an individual based on physical or physiological characteristics. But actually, when we go back to see whether or not something that a body had responsibility to comply to, photographic images would not be contained in that. And so we would be at this kind of strange disjunction between the two. Whereas if you put something on a strong, if we put this definition in some form on a primary legislative footing, and that applied to Criminal Procedure Scotland Act 1995, then now we're talking about primary legislation that is future-proofed. So there's also that kind of tricky piece there in terms of where we want to place this.
Thank you. Can I also ask the panel of you? This has been alluded to very briefly previously, but it's very specific. The legislation talks about Police Scotland and the SP. It makes no mention of British Transport Police. It makes no mention of the National Crime Agency. And nervous though it makes people, it makes no mention of the security services, who, of course, operate in Scotland in conjunction with both Police Scotland and the British Transport Police. Do the panel think that that's a gap?
And no to IT does. We believe that these secret services should be accountable as much as possible. I would also make the point that when we are calling for a Scottish Privacy Commissioner, which is what we are doing, we do not want to see that as a stick with which to beat the press. We would want the press to be protected and the press to be supported. And indeed, the press is often the greatest champion of privacy. That's historically proven. And we believe that the press has exposed wrongdoing by the secret services of various kinds, including extraordinary rendition, which Scotland was involved in because Prestwick Airport was used for extraordinary rendition, which is farming people out for torture by the United States in black sites, let it be said. This sort of thing must be stopped, and we believe that any commissioner, even if you do settle for this narrow role, which I'm suggesting you shouldn't, should have this under their remit.
Some of the issues there that you're raising come again down to the matter of what's devolved and what's reserved. And national security is a reserved matter, and as Professor Wiles said last week, you know, he has that responsibility UK-wide. So I think it'll be difficult to get these UK-wide elements contained within the bill without going through the other legislative mechanisms, which you're more familiar with than I.
that apply to British Transport Police then, Dr.
British Transport Police is obviously a slightly different kettle of fish. And again, I mean, he did last week make the reference to where British Transport Police make an arrest in Scotland and where the retention comes in there, and again said the Scottish regime should be the appropriate one. It makes me wonder that, whether the British Transport Police should at least be consulted, added to the list of consultees. But we certainly wouldn't give any particular view on whether or not it should be within the remit of a Scottish Biometric Commissioner or not.
I wonder, Mr. Rice, if I may, just very briefly, if you would form a view that a Scottish citizen would have regard to the jurisdiction of these organisations if they were subject to, facial recognition or samples, whether that's important to them or whether they would anticipate that it would be this Parliament would regulate how they are treated. And I'm genuinely not making a constitutional point here. I'm trying to understand the overlap that exists across the law enforcement agencies that operate in Scotland. Yeah, so the British Transport Police is one that certainly jumps out in terms of being kind of unsatisfactorily covered here. And of course, where it comes to biometrics, the British Transport Police would actually have quite a lot of passage within that, and a lot of activity is based around the collection of biometrics and the use of that. And I think the really, really pertinent point is if what we have here is a commissioner that would say, for instance, as we've called for, have an individual complaints mechanism in place that would allow for members of the public to raise concerns about the way it's been used. If there is some sort of problem where, like you said, a Scottish citizen in Prestwick is detained and has their biometrics taken in some way or used in some way, where does their complaint flow to? If you have a strong commissioner that covers, say, any policing activity that would occur on the, rather than security services or national security, which again I think might be best preserved for the time being, if you had any activity that occurred, policing activity that occurred in Scotland, then it would sit within the remit of this commissioner. But that's on the basis that, as we say, there should be some kind of public-facing front door for the public to come to raise concerns. And I think if you start to then make these distinctions, particularly around policing, British Transport Police, Police Scotland, it will leave the public confused about what they can rely on this commissioner to do. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Shona.
Good morning, panel. We've touched on this before, and I think Matthew Rice particularly got into some of this earlier on, but it's obviously accepted that biometric technologies are evolving at a rapid rate, and it's hard to predict what it will look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. So, does the bill, as introduced, represent I guess a reasonable attempt to keep up with developments in this area? And going back to the Code of Practice, whether that's all that's going to be required to deal with the increasing use and changing nature of biometric technologies, or will further legislation be required in the future? And Matthew Rice, you were touching on whether or not primary legislation was adequate at the moment, but in terms of future technologies, is that going to require further legislation, either primary or secondary, or can we rely on the Code of Practice being able to be swift enough and light enough on its feet to cover changing technologies?
So in Open Rights Group's kind of assessment, there's sort of three pieces that can change the dynamics here. You've got the technology that can change hugely. You've got bodies that can change in terms of how it's used, and then you also have case law that can change the way that something is framed. In terms of the technology, what's on this bill in terms of a definition of biometric data, that is serving quite well a kind of future-proofing measure. Because it doesn't necessarily refer to a specific biometric attribute that might not be in use, but any biometric attribute that may come into being used. So, for instance, if gait recognition and, say, speech recognition became a general policing kind of a policing power or a policing practice, then they would still be caught under this definition. But this definition would only apply to a code of practice that is on secondary legislation footing. So there is still that need to attend to the Criminal Procedure Scotland Act and any other subsequent acts to make sure that where that's engaged, that it refers to a more generic definition of biometrics. The other piece is around case law. So while we've had a judgment in South Wales that said that the use of automated facial recognition is in accordance with the law as it is currently understood, that judgment had a lot to do with the facts that were involved, and there are other litigation that is in track, led by Big Brother Watch, but also ones that are still pending, such as Gaughran, which has moved past the Supreme Court, which may change the nature of what data could be retained for. And so I think you also need to be able to have this commissioner in this role be able to respond to changes in case law as part of a common law jurisdiction. We're going to have to be able to react to that, which is why perhaps still having some form of codes of practice and secondary legislation for ministers to pass would be good, but it's not the best thing to start off the blocks with, because we still need a strong primary footing. And then ultimately you have the bodies. This would bind a commissioner just to policing, and it's quite clear that there are practices that go beyond policing and that public concern goes beyond policing. So very briefly, the Ada Lovelace Institute had recently done some very, very good citizen juries over the summer on a report called Beyond Face Value. I recommend the committee to pick that up and perhaps contact Ada Lovelace about it. And they showed quite clearly that the public's concern is not just on law enforcement. In fact, they have a heightened concern about private bodies' use of this technology and other public bodies' use. And so I think that's the third part. So if we look at it, we've done okay with technology, but I don't think we've necessarily on this bill figured out how we react to case law and how we react to the changing nature of who adopts this technology.
Okay.
Could I put my point again? It makes no sense to me to have a facial recognition commissioner who doesn't cover CCTV. These images are on a continuum. Facial recognition is simply a more high-resolution picture data than a CCTV image. So it makes no sense to have someone solely dedicated to facial recognition. We need a commissioner who covers all imagery, all intrusive camera work, by whatever agency, the police, the secret services, the public sector, schools, which are abusing it. There's research on that. Schools, pupils don't like being spied upon, and there's disproportionate use of CCTV. We're not against CCTV or indeed facial recognition in some contexts, but we are against the growth of the database society and state. So we think this crying need, which the public has expressed many times, needs to be properly met with a proper Scottish Privacy Commissioner, which is what Canada has, working alongside, sometimes in tension with, sometimes cooperating with, the Canadian FOI Commissioner or Information Commissioner.
Anybody else?
Just to be clear, Professor Duff's kind of characterisation of just a facial recognition commissioner, I mean, that's clearly not what we're talking about here. This is biometric data, has a much wider generic definition that touches on other forms of identification. So I wouldn't say that we're talking about a facial recognition commissioner here, despite the fact that it's quite obviously it's a topic that probably sits at the front in people's concerns. We are thinking a bit, we understand this to be a bit wider than that.
But it doesn't go down the scale to CCTV. So there's a disconnect. It makes no sense. CCTV issues are the slippery slope that leads to facial recognition issues.
Point, and you've made it very well. Thank you very much.
I won't mention it again.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to your question. I think to some degree your question highlights for me what that gap is in relation to not having the code of practice on the face of the legislation, that we could actually have that conversation. Does the code of practice, as it's in the legislation, give us that protection? We're not in a position to have that detailed discussion about whether the code does that. The purpose of the code is to enable clarity over the protection of people's rights. The code as it's currently drafted is robust, it's been heavily consulted on, and it provides very clear principles which allow you to look at actually a whole range of interventions, biometric being the key ones, from that perspective. That's the purpose of it. It's a code which it's a principled analysis which allows you to look at a whole range of interventions to say how are people's rights being breached here or not. And something that hasn't been highlighted in this evidence session, although it may have been elsewhere, is that presumption of non-retention, and because that's not in the legislation as it currently is. That's a crucial protection that isn't here because the code isn't in the legislation, and therefore that for me is one of the fundamental keys that if we're going to retain legislation, we have to be very clear why we're doing it, and that the principles around that are also explicit and referred to. Without that, we're in all sorts of grey areas and mush where that clarity isn't explicit. So it's a sort of chicken and egg. If we had the code here, we would be able to, robustly comment on whether or not it was strong enough to give the protections into the future. I think the draft version, as it is, had absolutely had that in mind, that recognition that things will change, and the capacity to review in order to ensure that is here, that capacity to review and relay the code of practice is really important, because it needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to be, but its purpose is to protect people's rights, and so I think that's for me another argument really for putting it on the face of the bill.
And it is something to bear in mind that the most significant judgments in this field, whether that be S and Marper or RJFC versus the Metropolitan, did not necessarily go down to the use of the biometric data, but the retention of it. So it has always often been that the courts have really turned on the nature of retention and how long something is retained for. And one of the great victories with the Independent Advisory Group's report was this establishment, or this promotion of a presumption in favour of deletion. And I'd say that that is key, particularly from anyone that might be concerned about the growth of a database state. If you have a system where certain data will be retained, and in fact the database state will shrink at a certain point because the deletion or the retention periods would lapse, that's a huge piece. And of course, like I said, the courts are very keen to that when it comes down to kind of deciding on Article 8 interference.
Okay, thank you.
The bill, as introduced, does not provide for an ethics advisory group. However, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has indicated it's his intention to establish such a group. My understanding is that the bill doesn't prevent the Commissioner for setting up an ethics group. So the first question is, do you think an ethics group should be set up? And the second question is if so, who would be best to do so? From the Commission perspective, we think there should be an ethics advisory group. We think that again, the territory is changing, it's evolving. It's quite difficult for one individual to hold all the knowledge they're required to have to do their job, and we think it should be on a statutory basis, and yes, it could sit within the Commissioner, but I think the recommendations from the advisory group would that been an independent advisory group, but would be advising the Commissioner, as well as presumably the general landscape in terms of the people who are actually using the biometrics to deliver their functions. I would also like to comment, if possible, I'm just concerned about time, when you're due to finish, that on the specific powers that have been, granted or not to the Commissioner. So I just wanted to make that point. Okay. Other views?
I think there needs to be an ethics committee. I don't think any Commissioner could work without an ethics committee, because the issues are so difficult, the balancing of rights, despite everything I've said, I believe the police have rights, and the security services and the secret services. It's very difficult to get it right, and there's no way all the wisdom could reside in the head of any one individual. So not to have an ethics committee would be an impossibility. I'd imagine.
Okay, and others, I suppose it was just following on from the evidence last week where I think it was Professor Wells has said he was surprised that it's the Justice Secretary who set up a committee as opposed to the Commissioner, and there should be an ethics, if there's going to be, it should be transparent and the findings open. I suppose it's just a separation between government and what's seen as independent. I think that was the point that was being made.
And yeah. I'm not fully sure that what the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, when he announced in front of the, I think it would be in the subcommittee, was referring to a permanent ethics group. It seemed to me that it was closer to what we saw with an independent advisory group that was formed for a temporary period of time to look at an issue and produce recommendations. So I don't know. I mean, we haven't heard anything since about what the terms of reference of that group would be. So I'm not sure whether I would. I certainly didn't, when I read it, I didn't see, that's the Ethics Advisory Group being formed just then and there by the Cabinet Secretary. I think it would be a sensible Commissioner, when they come into post, would see that there is a wealth of knowledge that sits across academia and civil society in Scotland that could be kind of pulled on to help with these tricky discussions.
It's for us to drill back down with the Cabinet Secretary. Anything to add?
I mean, data ethics is becoming an increasingly important subject given the growth in personal information and the way that it's collected, and we'd certainly support an independent ethics panel that the Commissioner can speak to and debate issues over. So it would be the Commissioner rather than the Minister.
Thank you. James.
Okay, thank you, Convener. One of the jobs of the Commissioner is to raise awareness in relation to biometrics, of the roles and the powers of Police Scotland and the SPA. How do you think that can be best achieved so that the public have confidence in the system?
Do you want to go into that?
Actually, I think if you want the public to have confidence in the system, then the Commissioner needs to have more power than just in awareness raising. To be perfectly honest, it's not that awareness raising is it's useful, it's important, enables people to understand the terms of the debate, what's at stake. It can raise awareness of the discussions that an independent ethics advisory committee would have, and that also is important, but that isn't sufficient, in my view. So in order for the public to have confidence, the Commissioner would need more power than an awareness-raising power. They would need the power to compel evidence, to have entry to specific places, to investigate, to inquire, and also to potentially to inspect in a similar way to HMI CS. So there's a range of other powers that you could explore to say, well, what actually is going to give that confidence that the Commissioner has the teeth and able to ensure that the authorities in question are actually fulfilling their duty to comply with the code of practice. So there's that would be, I suppose, is my first answer to your question. As a commission in and of itself, we as the Human Rights Commission, who also has a duty to raise awareness and do a huge amount to raise awareness of human rights. And clearly, there's a whole range of tactics that would come into play. And that's important. So it's not that it's not important; it's that it's not sufficient. So I would include it absolutely in the mandate of the Commissioner, but also to considerably strengthen it.
Anybody else?
I think this would be a very important part of the role of either the reduced Commissioner you have in mind or the expanded one I have in mind. Raising public awareness about privacy issues is absolutely vital. And I would cite the Scottish Information Commissioner as having shown good practice in this matter. Indeed, as we sit here, I have Paul Much from the Scottish Information Commissioner's Office lecturing to my 50 undergraduate journalism students because I'm missing the lecture for this committee. And he has kindly agreed to speak about FOI to these students, and he's done that over several years, and I've seen tremendous work by that office in raising awareness about FOI. So I think we need a comparable, level of commitment to raising the standard for privacy in Scotland. So they should have a budget for this, very definitely, I think.
So if we look at something like another commissioner and how they're formed, the Information Commissioner's Office runs campaigns like Your Data Matters, which is a fantastic way to raise awareness and has shown that there's been a real return in the public's understanding. But the other piece that within the ICO's strategic, I feel bad. I feel like I'm speaking on behalf of Dr. MacDonald, but it's merely as an illustration. The ICO considers individual complaints mechanisms as an aspect of raising public confidence if you look at their strategic role. So having that public awareness and public access to the Commissioner has been key to the success of raising awareness and confidence. And so we would maintain that having some kind of front door, some kind of way that an individual can approach the Commissioner to raise a concern, and the Commissioner has a way to address, look at and respond to that individual is one of these really key functions that gives the public a bit like that real confidence that they've got a Commissioner that is on not just their side, but the sides of rights and enforceability.
I have to just welcome what Matthew said. And it's good to hear a stakeholder actually speak up for what we've been doing. Clearly, for us, in terms of our responsibilities in data protection, and it's a key for individuals to know how their data is being handled, who it might be passed to, how long it might be retained for. It's a message that all data controllers, all organisations that are collecting data should be giving to the data subjects, the people involved, and anything which improves their understanding of what's happening to their information has to be welcomed. And obviously this is just another element of that.
Just building on Mr. Rice's specific point about raising the public having the ability to raise concerns. The bill is drafted doesn't really have a mechanism for that. It doesn't have a mechanism for raising complaints. Is that something that you think should be examined as the bill goes through its amendment process? If I can ask the other panel members.
Yeah, I agree. That's one of the means by which you could increase that engagement with the Commissioner and actually reinforce the Commissioner's ability to perform what we feel should be their function, which is to monitor and regulate the use of biometric data by the police and by Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. So it would be dependent on the purpose of the Commissioner's role being strengthened as well.
Element here, of course, where there is potential misunderstanding between the role of the Biometrics Commissioner and the role of the Information Commissioner. We would be the body to which they would come if their information rights had been violated in any way, if they had any concerns that there was a breach in their rights there, whereas the Biometrics Commissioner has got the other responsibilities in terms of reviewing policy and practice. And people do need to know where the correct place is to go. We still, 10 years on since the Scottish Information Commissioner's Office and more, 10 years and more, 2005 it was, wasn't it? 14 years, time's passing. We still have confusion with people who really should know. I'm talking about civil servants, senior public authority officials, etc., getting confused between the role of the Scottish Information Commissioner and ourselves.
I think we've covered that pretty well, thank you. And finally, you wanted to come very briefly, Liam, with we're going to finish at 15:15 at the very latest.
Excellent. Can I thank Dr. MacDonald for not including that list of people who may have confused the two roles MSPs, as I'm sure he was keen to do.
Reveal any personal information about members around the table.
Living the dream. I appreciate that the ICO perhaps provides an example of where those independent individual engagements can help raise public awareness, but I'm sure you're aware that the previous Children and Young People's Commissioner got into a lot of difficulty in terms of the expansion of that Commissioner's role by advocating a move in that direction. but with very little detail around what the implications were in terms of the resources required, the staffing required, etc. So, I mean, in terms of proposing that for this Commissioner, is there a clear understanding about what that would likely entail in terms of individual engagements and therefore the impact on resources?
I think the situation with the Children's Commissioner was such that the way in which the Act was enacted, it was quite vague in which what the areas he was to cover. And it was basically anything that's been excluded from anywhere else, and that did lead to debate. And I remember that at through the passing of the bill itself, we raised a number of concerns about that. I think this is clearer. There's still potential for dispute between a Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and ourselves, but you can look at the experience that Professor Wiles related to last week in terms of his engagement with my Commissioner. We've got a good working relationship. They meet at senior level, they meet informally at less senior levels on a regular basis. And to date, there's been no need for any form of MOU or anything like that, although we are aware of a couple of issues that are coming up because of Brexit and exchange between the UK and the other EU countries that may involve some agreement between us as where our exact roles differ.
I was going to commend you at the start, and you've managed to get to the end of the session. You've actually managed to mention the Brexit word before we came. So you've blotted your copybook, but that's helpful. Thank you.
Ways the Commissioner's powers could be strengthened. An individual complaint mechanism is one way, but there are a range of ways that the Commissioner's powers could be strengthened. And actually, in order for them to actually fulfil that duty of investigating or monitoring or ensuring compliance with the Code of Practice, they would require more powers than this legislation currently gives them. So it really is about looking at it from that strengthening perspective and saying, yeah, there are resource implications. To be honest, there's resource implications of any power that is attributed to an authority like ourselves, as we know. And so I do think there are resource implications. But what would be important from the Human Rights Commission is that the Commissioner has a range of tools in his or her toolbox, depending on the circumstances. And over time, probably, you would be able to see, well, which ones have the most impact, which ones are most effective, which ones has the Commissioner been able to employ, which have held authorities to account, because that's and enable that monitoring, data gathering, understanding, facilitation of an independent advisory group. That's all of that is resource, has resource implications. So I agree with you about the individual mechanism, but there are a range of ways that could be strengthened, and at the moment I think that it would be good to see some of them in the legislation.
Thank you.
And finally, Liam McCare.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be brief. There have been concerns raised about the accuracy of biometric technologies, in particular facial recognition. How valid are those concerns in your view? And following on from that, what steps would you envisage the Commissioner taking to ensure that the biometric technologies that are used are actually fit for purpose?
So it's a well-documented issue, particularly as it pertains to the fact that these systems are trained on data sets, right? So it's a question about what data you're putting in to make these decisions before you even release this technology into the wider public. So there's perhaps accuracy issues actually begin very much in the development of these systems rather than being able to perhaps improve in the kind of general public. There's a lot more evidence. There's fantastic work that's done by many in focusing on the Metropolitan Police rollout, which has a lot more of the false positive rate issues. In terms of what this can fix, what this bill could address, one of the pieces that the Independent Advisory Group pulled out was specifically looking at accuracy as a principle. that was a principle that needed to be embedded within the code of practice. You could get very specific and talk about perhaps like a technological kite mark that would say this system cannot go out unless it's been trained on this particular data set that has this level of diversity or something like that. But if you don't, I think that the important piece there is that it's, for the independent advisory group, it carried a principled view in terms of determining accuracy. And at the moment, England and Wales don't, their assessment is not about the accuracy, but perhaps more about the proportionality of the measure. So they don't really have that principle embedded in the way that we've seen both South Wales and Metropolitan Police use of facial recognition. Accuracy hasn't been a determinative factor because it just isn't actually in play. So I think that the fix there is that accuracy is a principle for the Commissioner to address.
It's not long since facial recognition software determined that 20 members of the US Congress were criminals. All of these, I hasten to add, were false positives. But the issue of accuracy is, you know, sooner or later, all these cameras will be fully accurate. We've got to be aware of that. You know, there might be difficulties now, but we're moving to a position where there will be complete accuracy. So I don't think that we can frame any legislation in terms of accuracy. I think we've got to assume that sooner or later there will be complete recognition, and you know, we will be completely exposed, and we need to envisage that destination when we set up laws and codes of practice now, because it's only a matter of time before all of these technicalities will have been resolved.
That's us. That concludes our questioning. Can I thank the panel for what's been a very worthwhile evidence session. We'll now suspend for a change of witnesses and a comfort break. Agenda item 3 is an evidence session with senior officers from Police Scotland on their contingency planning to respond to the UK's departure from the European Union. We've received written submissions from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and the Scottish Prison Service. I refer members to paper 3, which is a paper by the clerks, and paper 4, which is a private paper. And I welcome our witnesses. Deputy Chief Constable Will Kerr, Police Scotland, and Detective Chief Superintendent Patrick Campbell of the Specialist Crime Division with Police Scotland. And I thank the witnesses for providing written evidence in advance of our meeting today. This has been provided by Police Scotland to the SPA board on Brexit planning previously and now submitted to us today, and this is extremely helpful, so thank you very much for that. And I understand, Deputy Chief Constable Kerr, you'd like to make a short opening statement.
With your indulgence, Convener, yes. Thank you very much. Good morning, and good morning to members of the committee, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and speak to the committee today. I think it's important to state at the outset, probably a fairly obvious point, that whilst there's a complex set of planning assumptions around Brexit, as it's known, and operational plans to try and mitigate the risks associated with it, there's still a lot of unknowns for us, so it's very difficult to predict all the scenarios that we would like to. That's an uncomfortable position for policing sometimes, not being able to predict everything with the degree of certainty that we'd sometimes like. I have 3 very brief observations, Convener, to make at the beginning, more from the perspective of setting some general context. Firstly, Police Scotland's planning for an operational response to Brexit has really shown the benefits of a single national service. So our ability to be able to plan for it right across the country, to set up intelligence support and provisions, to set up the operational assets that we need, including the Force Reserve of 300 officers, to move flexibly to any part of the country, supported by still strong local visible community teams, has been a real bonus for us over the last 6 to 12 months as we've been planning for Brexit. That gives us that capacity and flexibility, because one of the biggest operational risks we have, not least at this time of year, is what we call operational concurrence, just a lot of things happening at once as we enter the winter season. I'd be very happy to talk to those risks in some detail later if members wish me to. We also recognise the very clear public concern there is around the exit from the EU, and we've been, as you've highlighted in your introduction, Convener, every month going to our accountability body, the SPA, to talk as openly as we can be about what we're doing, what concerns us, how we're planning, what mitigations we're putting in place as a police service to try and protect communities right across Scotland. That's my first point. Secondly, I've been very fortunate. I'm now in my 31st year in policing, to have worked in many different parts of these islands, including in Northern Ireland and London before I was fortunate enough to come and work in Police Scotland. I can say without hesitation that what I've experienced in Scotland in terms of the partnership arrangements here, both how the Strategic Resilience Partnership, as chaired by the DFM, the Local Resilience Partnerships, the arrangements and relationships between the local authorities, policing, other Category 1 Civil Contingency Act responders is actually more mature in Scotland than I've experienced in other jurisdictions. That becomes important as we try and manage the relationship between operational plans and practical delivery. It's easy to have a plan on a piece of paper. It's a lot more difficult to make sure it works in practice. And those plans have been regularly road tested over the course of the last 6 months. And the Multi-Agency Coordination Centre, which is housed in a police facility in Bilston Glen, is a very good example of that. Again, I'm happy to talk to that in detail, should members wish me to. Finally, one of our biggest concerns, one of my biggest concerns, is the unpredictability of the environment that we face at the moment, where in terms of the reaction of the public to rapidly evolving and rapidly changing events, and in that rapidly changing environment, words and behaviour matter. So the importance of temperate and responsible language and behaviour from those in positions of civic leadership, from politicians, from anybody who has a degree of leadership responsibility across Scotland and wider, cannot be overstated. People are entitled to express strongly held views. And there are a range of obviously strongly held views on this issue, and Police Scotland will protect that right to express those strongly held views, but they must be expressed peacefully and lawfully. And I end with that obvious point, Convener, because I think certainly some of the issues we've seen recently, some of the language being used, makes it more difficult to police the environment. And I think it's very important that we have an open and transparent debate about that issue as well. So thank you very much for your...
Okay, thank you. Straight to questions, and John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. DCC Care, thanks for that update, and thanks also for your written submission, as the Convener says. That's very helpful. Excuse me. I know colleagues are going to ask about the deployment issue, but can you maybe just set out for the committee the background to the Force Reserve, maybe the number of officers that are involved, and whether that reserve was specifically set up as a response to Brexit, please?
Yes, I can, of course, Mr Finney. We were concerned, obviously, in our planning arrangements for Brexit. We were concerned about the increased likelihood of disruption or disorder, and hopefully not the latter, and the need to have a flexible asset that we could move about the country as and when we needed to. So I made a decision earlier in the year to create this, what was called the Force Reserve. It's 300 police officers. They're formed in what are called 12 PSUs, 12 public support units. So those 12 units are self-contained public order units that can be moved flexibly across the country as the need arises. They're forward-based in both the east, the west and the north of the country. And the Jackton, Redford Barracks, Oakley, Dundee, Aberdeen. We've stood them up. I'd stood them up in February and March this year, and then again with effect from the 5th of August, principally to deal with Brexit-related matters. We haven't had any Brexit-specific disorder, thank goodness, to date, so they have been gainfully employed doing a range of other duties, whether it's policing some of the parades and associated issues in Govan, whether it's dealing with environmental protests, whether it's dealing with normal serious crime, warrant execution, etc., etc. And as is covered in the paper, they were deployed over 500 times in August alone. And it's a bit of a, frankly, it's a bit of a trade-off for us when it comes to that Force Reserve, because we're abstracting from obviously divisions and local policing to create a Force Reserve that's used to police events that we would have had to police anyway and abstract from anyway. What we wanted in Police Scotland was the flexible facility of having a large reserve that we can move about the country to keep different parts of the country safe as and when the need arises. But what we've also done is we've, because we wanted to minimise the impact in local policing, we've actually pushed about 120 officers out from middle and backroom functions to go out and work in frontline policing again to try and minimise the impact in local divisions of that Force Reserve as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Liam Kerr.
With John Finney's line of question, if I may. So you talked about DCC Care, the 500 deployments of the reserve in August. Are you able to say were any of those Brexit related at all at this stage?
Only tangentially and not directly, no. So there's a whole range of other duties, but they wouldn't have been... I mean, the difficulty, I suppose, at the moment is that there's a growing range of protest activity across the country, and sometimes there can be a conflation of what those issues are about. So we end up with environmental protests, we end up with protests born against independence, we end up with a range of other issues, and sometimes there may be some Brexit-related protesters in part of those groups. So we police the event, whilst it is sometimes hard to discern and decipher and disaggregate what the cause of the issue is, more obvious than others sometimes. So, but the straight answer is no, very, very little Brexit-related demand for that Force Reserve to date, but it's there as an asset in case we need it.
And should Brexit result in the Force Reserve being used specifically to deal with Brexit-related incidents, are you able to say what impact that would have on day-to-day policing across the country?
Yeah, well, it's an issue, Mr Kerr, we've been very concerned about, and that's why, as I indicated to Mr Finney, we've been trying to push some officers out from middle and backroom functions to support local policing. I can't, in all honesty, sit here and say if there's a protracted period of disorder or disruption that there isn't going to be an impact on local policing. Of course there is. Common sense would tell us that. By setting up this Force Reserve, though, we're trying to get ahead of that curve. We're trying to manage that resource so that with a single central command and control function at Bilston Glen, as we've set up in the multi-agency coordination centre, we can move that asset about the country as and when we see fit. And we've seen lots of operational dividends from that already. So, you know, whether it's XR protests in Edinburgh, whether it's dealing with the disorder in Glasgow around the parades recently in the last couple of weeks, there's been a significant operational benefit from having that available.
Thank you.
Jenny.
Good morning to the panel.
Good morning.
I'd just like to pick up on Liam Kerr's line of questioning with regard to Brexit, and you'll be aware that you alluded to this yourself, DCC Kerr, just there in the wake of recent sectarian incidents in Glasgow. It has been suggested that Brexit is acting as some sort of catalyst to fuel this behaviour. And terrorism expert Kevin Toulis has said that somehow Brexit has unleashed these forces that were dormant. The tragedy of Brexit is that we have lost a national consensus. So I just want to ask what communication Police Scotland has had then with colleagues in Northern Ireland on this issue.
Well, a lot, and I spent the first 27 years of my policing career in Northern Ireland, so I still have a lot of professional contacts back into the country. There's always a risk, of course, at a time of political uncertainty, political fragility perhaps, there's always a risk that those in the extremes are going to look to exploit that situation. We've seen some of the evidence of that recently. We have established right at the outset and still are maintaining an EU exit intelligence cell so that we can do, as you would expect us to do on your behalf, open source monitoring, looking at social media commentary, looking at some of the groups who may be in the extreme fringes, who may be more inclined to be involved in some of this disorder. Part of that intelligence overview and work involves reaching out, as we do on a daily basis, to colleagues in Northern Ireland to see if there's any associated risk across RIC. And there are some risks of, I suppose we could probably describe them as proxy symptoms as well, about a rise in hate crime. We haven't seen that in Scotland, unlike our colleagues in England and Wales, for which we're obviously grateful and working very hard to try and maintain that. But to give you a sense of perspective, I hope, in answer to your question, frankly, what I'm more concerned about at the moment is not the high-end disorder. I hope I'm not proved wrong on that. If it happens, we'll deal with it, as you would expect. But it's actually the low-end disruption that you might get from people being genuinely annoyed, at large queues at the borders and at ports. It's the if you end up with some viral image of an empty shelf in a supermarket, that all of a sudden within 2 to 3 days you could end up with protests or concern at supermarkets around food or fuel shortages. That's the sort of stuff that's incredibly resource intensive for us to police. But it's not high-end disorder, it's just people are genuinely worried or concerned. But in this social media age, that flash to bang can sometimes only take 12 to 24 hours. We're more concerned about that at the moment than anything else.
Yeah. And obviously, we as politicians have a responsibility to conduct ourselves appropriately and use appropriate and responsible language, which you mentioned previously. And on that point, just yesterday, Conservative Party Chairman James Cleverly said that Brexit is a warning shot, and he argued that democracy breaks if votes are not respected. And you'll be aware that the Prime Minister has been criticised previously for his use of language, accusing those who support remaining in the European Union of betraying the people, and describing those who are trying to block Brexit as being part of some sort of surrender kind of operatives, and he described what's happening in Westminster as the Surrender Act. Do you think that dangerous political rhetoric is stirring some sort of civil unrest in the background, or do you think it's feeding into that narrative of this kind of low-level behaviour you spoke about there, spilling out into perhaps bigger, an idea of disruption more broadly?
Well, I let politicians deal with the political commentary about comments from other politicians, but I'll reinforce what I said at the beginning, which is we all have a responsibility to use temperate and responsible language. And actually, at a time of heightened emotional and political tension, words and behaviour do matter, and they do have an impact on the behaviour of people in the street, and we all have to exercise that restraint and caution and responsibility to make sure that those words aren't manifest in the behaviour or used as an excuse or justification by people in the extremes who are looking to engage in violence or disorder.
Thank you.
Unfinished.
Thank you, Convener. You touched on this earlier, Mr. Kerr. I wonder if you could expand on the issue of testing and exercising of command and control and response arrangements with resilience partners. Who's involved and what scenarios are being played out in training and exercising events, please?
Yes, of course, happy to give a bit of flavour to that. As I said at the beginning, it's hard to predict every scenario when it comes to this, almost on a daily basis. Just when you think you couldn't be any more surprised, there's a different set of circumstances arise. I mentioned at the very beginning of my opening comments the relationship between the Strategic Resilience Partnership and the local resilience partnerships in Scotland. There's a subgroup of the strategic resilience partnership that deals specifically with arrangements and coordination and partnership arrangements between those agencies that you refer to, that's chaired by ACC Mark Williams, one of Police Scotland senior officers. It has a range of things from risk and mitigation templates, preparedness checklists. They've been working through this in the last 6 months. It's updated regularly. And actually I was reading through some of the detail from the EU subgroup last night, the 5 areas that they have been testing and exercising in. And just to give you a flavour of what they are, they're testing information flows, communications and reporting to make sure we're sharing information on a timely basis. That's the value of the multi-agency coordination centre, that we have everybody co-housed in the same place. They just have to talk across a desk, as opposed to being reliant on IT systems that might not necessarily be mutually compliant. The impact of concurrent risks alongside EU exit activation. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's a language that's been used around operational risk mitigation at the moment. We're worried about lots of things happening at once. So enter the winter, bad weather break, you end up with a season or a pandemic flu, you end up with coming up to Halloween, and there's policing challenges associated with Halloween as well, all at the same time as the UK's exit from the EU. All of those as concurrent risks add up to quite a significant compound risk. The involvement of health social care partnerships to make sure we can protect the vulnerable, not least in rural areas. Consideration of the recovery phase. And then just simple awareness sessions for partners and senior officers and local authorities and across other partners. So there's a range of testing going on in October. For example, exercise Crossbill on the 3rd of October, which is a Scottish Government exercise to test policy areas, SCORE, interaction, the Scottish Government Resilience Room, and the information flow to make sure that actually when information starts at a local level, and then we then go through that process of building up through local authorities, regionally, up to government, national, country level, to make sure that those systems and information flows are working as well as they can. So lots of testing going on, but still unpredictable in part.
No, I appreciate it's wide-ranging. Are you able to say, DCC Care, if the UK government are represented on your Resilience Committee?
Well, not on the one in Scotland, no, but there's a significant amount of connection, as you would expect, and engagement with partners south of the border as well. But I'm talking specifically about Scotland's preparations.
Are any UK agencies represented on that?
Yeah, there are. And obviously when we're dealing with health and social care arrangements, there's a range of connections down south. In policing terms, we have strong connections down south through what's called NPOC, the National Police Operations Coordination Centre. There's daily connections with respective partners down south as well.
I ask that because there's well-documented concerns that information hasn't necessarily been shared at governmental level, and I wonder what the impact is of that, because that will clearly have implications, I think, around issues about, continuity of medical supplies, things like that. Well,
to give you the honest answer to that question, we have been involved in the probably informed more than involved in the mainstream planning assumptions at a UK level. We're a lot more integrated, as you would expect it, in Scotland. I say mainstream planning assumptions because we've had to reach down into policing and other colleagues in England quite a bit, because it has tended at times some of those planning assumptions to be quite London or south of England centric, and we've been constantly reinforcing and asserting the very particular needs of Scotland, the different legal and constitutional arrangements in Scotland, to make sure that whatever arrangements are put into place at a UK level reflect those legal and constitutional differences. That hasn't always been the case in some of the planning assumptions. We've also, frankly, at times struggled to get access to some of the more sensitive elements or layers of those planning assumptions, and the Chief Constable actually went down to a meeting in London at the Home Office chaired by the Permanent Secretary last Friday to make exactly that point and assert our need to get access to all that information. He's actually flying out to The Hague this morning with the Director General of the National Crime Agency and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police to make exactly the same point, that we need to assert the needs of Scotland in these planning arrangements and the very distinct differences we have in this country as well.
So it's a genuine concern that the dearth of that information might affect your planning and the ability to provide resilience?
It's been a partial concern. I don't want to exaggerate it and say it's been a significant concern, but it has been a partial concern, not least around the availability and how quickly we're getting some of the more sensitive elements or layers of those planning assumptions, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Rona?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning.
Good morning.
In the event of a no-deal Brexit at the end of this month, we will no longer be members of Europol, and we won't have access to the European arrest warrant, which we know has been very successful in the past, and we've been able to arrest people within 4 hours in other European countries. Can I ask how much of a concern this is to you, and is there anything possible that could take its place?
Yes, it's a very big concern. I'll hand over to DCS Campbell to talk you through some of the detail.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have real concerns in respect of the contingency planning around the loss of some of the EU measures, the EU tools. So we will lose 36 come a no-deal outcome, which we're planning towards just now. That planning has been ongoing for the best part of 18 months with our other UK law enforcement partners. What we will move towards is a slower, less effective, more bureaucratic process and a significant reduction in capability. There is absolutely no doubt about that. The contingency processes that were built up with our UK partners around some of the main kind of headlines is round about the loss of the European arrest warrant, as you quite rightly point out, how successful that has been in the past. We roughly execute between 120 and 150 per year. Throughout the UK, roughly about 1,400, 1,500 per year executed. So the loss of that capability is really significant. But what we have been doing is working with Crown Office. We have built in basically a parallel process around about the Council of Europe 1957 Convention, which basically gives us the power under the Interpol notices to thereafter look at extradition. Again, the process will be far slower than we have with European arrest warrants. European arrest warrants, if we're putting hands on someone across the EU states, certainly it's sometimes days before we can bring them back. We are talking months with referring to the extradition process. So again, slower, more bureaucratic, but we will still have the powers, and that's what we'll be preparing for just now. Europol, for example, come the 31st of October, we will leave Europol, we will physically leave that building, and thereafter we will have to apply to get back in. Significant loss of Europol. Again, I think I could underestimate regarding the problems that will cause us. That picking up a phone, speaking to our law enforcement partners across Europe with the facility we have at Europol will go. And as I say, we will have to apply for readmittance to Europol. How long that will take, we've been told could take weeks, could take months to get back in there and under the third country status similar to the USA and Canada. So again, some real challenges with that as well. The loss of the powers for Eurojust as well is another real concern when about some of the joint investigations we have with some of our EU partners will also fall at this particular stage. So a real challenging arena. Loss of access to systems and automatic processes that we have in place with our EU partners just now. Reduced operational consistency with our EU member states is also a concern. No direct access to EU intel systems, again, so the whole loss of the powers that we have at present. So I think let's be very clear, the model we are moving towards, come a no-deal scenario, will significantly impact on our ability to keep the communities of Scotland safe.
Thank you. That definitely sounds like a real step backwards in your operational capability. Are you aware of any, let's say in the event of a deal, whatever that might be, has there been any negotiations that you're aware of that might allow these to continue? Yeah.
If we move towards a deal in respect of that, and there is a transition period, we will keep the tools until December 2020. So we will maintain the 36 EU tools during that transition period, and it will give us more time to thereafter negotiate some of the additional processes we may need to put in place.
Thank you, that's helpful.
And in the event of a no deal, are there any ways that, some of the things you've outlined, which, do sound quite extensive, can be mitigated?
Yeah, as I say, we've built in processes with our other UK law enforcement partners around about contingencies for the loss of all of the measures. So there are fallbacks in respect of the measures that we will lose. However, I would say they are far more bureaucratic, far more slow time. As I say, that's one of the great challenges. We have fallbacks for example, using Interpol. So we've put an officer from Police Scotland just now over into Interpol, just to give us that additional capacity across Europe as we move forward.
That's helpful to give some example, because it did sound quite bleak, and we don't want to be alarmist that, you know, we're not left in a vacuum, that there is something, albeit, you know, not as good as we have clearly at present. Fulton. Oh, sorry, Sean.
What you're saying, DCS Campbell, is hugely concerning and is bleak, because it seems to me that what you're saying, and just to be really clear here, that in 30 days' time, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the ability to arrest criminals within hours will go, and that will no longer be the case. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So, for example, a number of criminals that we are looking for across Europe who are wanted in European arrest warrants just now. So we have built in with Crown Office a parallel process round about the Extradition Act that allows us still to put hands on and arrest these individuals. It will be the process of bringing them back into Scotland, which will be more troublesome and more bureaucratic, so it will be a lot more slow time than we have just now. For example, for a European arrest warrant, roughly they have about 10 days to return to the UK at a particular time once we arrest them at that stage, but we anticipate that will now move to months and not days.
It's very concerning.
Okay, Fulton.
Convener, good morning, panel. Turning to the UK government's Operation Yellowhammer, do you agree that the scenarios set out in that document are the worst case, and specifically for Scotland?
I mean, there's been a lot of commentary around the Operation Yellowhammer planning presumptions and assumptions recently. I mean, they're not predictions. They're based on based on the worst plausible, not the most likely manifestation of the risk. And it might seem like a semantic distinction, but it's an important one, obviously, not least in terms of reassuring the public. And when they read this whole list of things that might possibly happen, but they might possibly happen because they are plausible. For policing purposes, they meet our definition under the Civil Contingency Act of an emergency. They meet our definition of a major incident, so we treat them like that. We treat them like that in how we road test it with partners to make sure we can respond quickly and effectively to communities across the country. So that, I mean, do we think all of those things are likely to happen? No, but some of them might. So what we're doing is just trying to mitigate all those risks as well as we currently can. And as I've said a couple of times, probably the biggest operational risk we have is lots of those things happening at once. There's those so-called concurrent risk scenario. It's not a great time to be leaving in terms of the winter. There's a range of other challenges that come with that. Halloween, talked about seasonal pandemic flu, talked about a range of other ongoing policing issues. And we've just been trying to mitigate that by a combination of working with uplifting our international bureau. Pat's talked about some of the tools we're going to use, deeply concerning to us. You know, we want to get people back here into this jurisdiction quickly if they've committed offences against Scottish citizens. But we've had to increase, more or less triple, the size of our international bureau to over 40 officers to make sure we can share intelligence in a timely manner. Our border policing command, we've added about another 25% officers. That's another 60 officers to work within border policing command to make sure we can control the flow or disruption at ports and airports. Those are officers who would have been doing other things, who we've had to put into some of these teams to try and mitigate some of these risks. So we're trying to be sensible about it. We're working really hard to identify a whole range of risks and work with partners to mitigate them. But if a number of them happen at once and they happen over a protracted period of time, of course, that's going to be a bit of a challenge for us.
It does sound like you're working really hard to put in, plans in a situation that, is not of your making and is very free flowing. In terms of the Yellowhammer document, were Police Scotland consulted on any of these worst case scenarios? Were you consulted as they were developing what the plausible worst case scenarios were?
Well, I think as I outlined to Mr Finney, I think the honest answer is that we were informed and not consulted about the UK mainstream planning assumptions. As I said, we're closely involved with Scottish Government planning assumptions that fell out of those broader UK planning assumptions. So we did get them. We are concerned, as I said before, that we're not getting some of the sensitive tiers of that information, and we're pushing in very hard, as you would expect, to make sure we get access to that. So But in Scotland, the arrangements, the partnership arrangements, relationships that we have with the partners is as mature as I've seen it in any other place. And I say that, as I say, after 30 years of doing this job.
Good.
Continued still in Operation Yellowhammer, where I think a scenario where there could be competing demands in government agencies has been covered, which by extension could put enforcement and response capabilities at risk. If I give you a couple of things that have been raised specifically, including illegal fishing, I think you've covered some of the border stuff but smuggling maybe more generally. What's Police Scotland more or less doing? What's its role, and what does it envisage doing with these particular examples?
Yeah, there has been a lot of discussion, Convener, certainly over the last number of months about the fisheries issue, and I suppose we have to be pragmatic about what we can realistically and practically do 12 miles off the shore, actually, as well. So we're working very closely with Marine Scotland at the moment to work up sensible risk assessments, deployment protocols. Marine Scotland are putting a liaison officer into the multi-agency control centre that will be set up full-time again from the 21st of October, so we can share information, talk to each other as and when we need. But we've also made it very clear that we do not anticipate, as far as fisheries specialist capability is concerned, that we'll be putting police officers on the trawlers 10, 12 miles off the shore. That's just not practical. Certainly in November in the North Sea, it's just not proportionate or practical. But we're going to have to manage those events somehow, not least if somebody reports crimes to us whenever they come back to shore. So there is a lot of discussion going on at the moment, but we're just trying to balance aspiration with realism in some of those areas.
Thank you for that. And Liam MacArthur.
Thanks very much. Indeed, talked about the strain on existing resources. Obviously, an area where already the strain is becoming unbearable is in relation to the size of our prison population. I think in terms of the custody capacity as well, I would suspect that's under serious strain. What assessment has been done about the potential impact of some of the disorder you've been talking about in relation to the custody capacity, but then I suppose knock on through the courts and the prison estate as well?
There have been a lot of discussions over the last couple of months with other criminal sector partners, not least the Crown Office, Scottish Prison Service, led by the Policing Division of the Scottish Government, about what we could do if we end up with mass arrests and what we do with people in the advent of mass arrests. So we've quite detailed and very comprehensive contingency plans in place, in that with a range of menu of tactical options, that we end up with a surge of arrests, hundreds of arrests, that either planned or unplanned, spontaneous or unseen, that we can move custody provision, our cellular custody provision, we can move that about the country. There are things we can do to try and mitigate that risk. But obviously, there's a significant issue with the prison population in Scotland at the moment, and if we end up with hundreds of arrests, we're going to have to look at alternative judicial measures to make sure that we don't exacerbate that problem. And there are a range of considerations that are being discussed at those meetings to make sure that we can try and mitigate that as well. But I say all that because hopefully to give you some reassurance that these discussions are taking place, what can we sensibly do to try and manage that risk if it arises. But I also need to be honest and say that if we end up in a position where there's protracted disruption, protracted disorder, we end up making hundreds of arrests, of course it's going to affect somewhere else in the rest of the system. It will, and there's no way we can avoid that. So we can mitigate the risk to an extent, but if we end up with a significant period of disorder that we don't foresee at this stage, that we don't have any intelligence to indicate is likely, then it will have an impact on normal business.
But in terms of the custody capacity, you believe that across the country there's potentially sufficient capacity, but what it would involve is individuals being moved around and accommodated, potentially quite far from wherever the arrest is taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have to be pragmatic about it.
And in terms of the response of Crown Office, and I wouldn't expect you to speak for Crown Office, but through those discussions, is the expectation that there would have to be diversions away from custody for the simple fact that there isn't the capacity in the prison estate at the moment to cope with any further bulge?
No, absolutely. Those are exactly the conversations that are going on with the Crown Office at the moment. And how can we sensibly deal with the full range, full spectrum of disposals for people who may be involved just in low-end disruption or disorder. That there may be alternative prosecution, alternative disposals that we can apply that don't involve custody. And as you can imagine, we're having those conversations with the Crown Office every week.
Okay. Thank you.
Supplementary, John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. DCC Kerr, this committee is fully aware of the steps that Police Scotland have taken and understands some of the background to the centralisation of custody facilities. I wonder if one of the contingencies you're looking at is the reuse of discarded premises, for instance. There's quite a number of locations that historically did house prisoners. That's more centralised now. Is that one of the options that's been looked at?
I think definitely redundant capacity will be one of the tactical options that we have to dip down into if we end up with hundreds of arrests. That poses its own challenges. You'll be aware around health and safety provision, about full compliance with recent HMICS inspection recommendations when it comes to custody provision. But as I've said a number of times, if we end up in that scenario, we're just going to have to be pragmatic about it if we end up with hundreds of arrests. So, but the short answer to your question is yes. If we end up in that scenario, part of the tactical options involve using some redundant estate, but only that estate that is up to a sufficient level and quality that actually we're not going to breach any health and safety laws.
Okay, that's reassuring. Thank you.
Apologies, following on from John Finney's line of questioning, are you taking advice at the moment about, both from HMICS but also from human rights experts, about the use of that redundant estate? Because I think the concerns would be that nobody underestimates the challenge you face in dealing with potentially serious situations in terms of an upsurge in civil unrest. But I think, were you holding in custody people in facilities that fell below a certain standard, and sense any likelihood of you taking forward cases in due course would be undermined if they fell short? You're taking that advice, are you?
I'm not aware of the detail. I'm sure we are, but I can give you an absolute assurance that we will not be housing detained persons in substandard, sub-quality accommodation where there's any risk to them. We simply won't be doing that.
Right. Okay, thank you.
It's probably worth just saying that the committee has received a submission from the Crown Procurator Fiscal and the Prison Service, just looking at the various scenarios, and the impact on our courts and our prisons, which I think the committee have found very helpful. James Kelly for our last question.
Yeah, sure, Convener. Police Scotland have stated that £8 million has been spent so far on Brexit. Can I ask, has that money been specifically allocated to the Police Scotland budget from the government in relation to Brexit, or has it had to be found from other areas of the budget?
It's now, the figure is now, Mr Kelly, at £8.9 million as of today or yesterday. The short answer to your question is no, it hasn't specifically been allocated to the Police Scotland budget, but we do have an undertaking from the Scottish Government, which we welcome, that they will pay up to £17 million of additional costs incurred by Police Scotland related to Brexit duties in this financial year.
So what areas of the budget is that £8.9 million been drawn down from, bearing in mind you've not been given a specific Brexit allocation at this time?
It's not been drawn down from any other area of the budget. What effectively is happening at the moment is it's growing the deficit this year. Effectively, we have a post-dated cheque from the Scottish Government that if we can spend up to £17 million, if we need to spend up to £17 million on Brexit-related duties, then the Scottish Government will cover that bill this year.
Okay, and supplementary, just to finish off.
Just drawing back, I think, to your response to the first question from John Finney in relation to the Forced Reserve, you explained the establishment, the rationale behind it, but also the deployment in recent times has been in response to Extinction Rebellion protests, or environmental protests more generally, sectarian protests. So in terms of the calculation of the 8.9 million, is the Forced Reserve establishment and operation included within that at the moment? Because to some extent it would seem counterintuitive to allocate that to Brexit, certainly at this stage, given the deployments that you've talked about over August.
Absolutely, and that's a really important question, and I'm grateful to you for asking it, because there can be some confusion around this issue. We have this discussion every month with the Scottish Police Authority, rightly. what was intended to happen was that as part of our deficit reduction plan agreed through the Scottish Police Authority with the Scottish Government a couple of years ago, we would have had to reduce capacity in terms of pure numbers by 100 last year and 300 this year to actually meet that budget deficit reduction target. The Chief Constable rightly made the decision that actually he wouldn't have the operational capacity if it dropped officers by 400 to actually maintain a resilient police service that would be able to respond to the needs of Scotland during this uncertain times and respond to all the various challenges and risks that come with Brexit. So he made a decision not to downsize Police Scotland by those 400 officers. That's essentially the cost of that has been accruing that £8.9 million to date. The cost of those 400 officers annualised over this financial year add up to about £17 million. So effectively, the cost is the cost of maintaining the capacity in Police Scotland to respond quickly and flexibly to the needs of Scotland as and when there's a risk associated with Brexit. But of course, in the interim, and by standing up this Force Reserve, they're engaged in lots of other duties across the country. But it's a capacity cost.
Okay. That concludes our questioning. Can I thank you very much for, obviously there's anxiety about what is going to take place then, but just for the very measured way and the reassurance you've given that every possible scenario is trying to be looked at, and some reassurance given. I think that's very helpful for the general public as well as the committee. Thank you very much. We're going to suspend briefly for to allow the witnesses to leave. Agenda item 4 is consideration of a response to the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on their request reviews on the procedure for the Scottish Law Commission bills. I refer a member to paper 5, which is the paper by the clerks, and invite comments from members. Are there any comments? John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. I think it's interesting that the committee maybe wishes to expand its remit, and it's not a committee I've served on or would necessarily want to serve on, but I think particularly in relation to something that's been said about the defamation and the potential for that committee dealing with that, I think that would be very unfortunate. We've done the preparatory work for that. We've held some discussions. So whilst I maybe understand some of the frustrations at their limited remit, I think we would have to exercise some caution if something that obviously fell within the remit of this committee wasn't considered by this committee.
Okay. They do certainly play an important role looking at the technical details. Are we broadly then content with the status quo as it is? Agreed? Yeah. Thank you for that. Agreed. We now move into, our next meeting will be on Tuesday, 8th of October, when we'll continue taking evidence on our pre-budget scrutiny of the Scottish Government 2020-21 draft budget with a focus on funding for the Scottish Prison Service. And with that, we now move into private session.